Cows Podcast, episode 257.
Welcome to the podcast that gives producers a platform to discuss and share paradigm-challenging practices. Practices that have increased the effectiveness of their operation and the joy that their families have received from this lifestyle.
Howdy, everybody. This is Clay Connery, host of the Working Cows Podcast, powered by the Global Ag Network. I am very excited to be joined today by Ray Marxer. Ray Marxer was the manager of the Beaverhead Ranch in southwest Montana. I think at its peak, that ranch was around 340,000 acres. Of course, it's owned by the Koch family. And so we're going to talk to him today about his new book, Cowboy in a Corporate World. We're going to cover just one small sliver of this book that I thought was a paradigm-challenging practice that we could talk about today, but I really can't recommend this book highly enough. I think it will be on the back table of many ranch workshops in the near future. If it isn't there already, it should be, I think, going there soon. So it is up on Amazon now. You can find a show note link in the show notes page, workingcows.net/257. You can also get copies of it at raymarxer.com. So you can find those links at workingcows.net/257. Go out and pick up a copy of that book. But for now, really excited to welcome Ray Marxer to the Working Cows Podcast. Ray, thanks for joining me today.
Glad to be here.
You, by the time this releases, I think you will have a book out on the market, Cowboy in a Corporate World. Tell me a little bit about what inspired you to write the book, why you wrote the book, and before you do that, I'll say this is what I said after reading the book. I said this is a fantastic book. It reads like a manual on so many essential skills for thriving in not just ranching and business, but also life. Skills like how to lead change in a large-scale business, how to advance within a corporate structure, how to make decisions in a complex system. But most importantly, this book will teach you about the essential role of faith in creating true success in all these endeavors. It does this without being heavy-handed, rather through telling stories and giving real-world, well-documented examples on everything from cow and horse selection and ecosystem improvement to walking faithfully with family and God through life. I think this book will be on the back table of many future ranching classes, along with classics like Kick the Hay Habit, No Risk Ranching, Thoughts and Advice from an Old Cattleman, Dirt to Soil, Knowledge-Rich Ranching, and Chip Hines' works. All that is to say nothing of the fantastic photography from a large working western ranch with beautiful landscapes, cowboys, cows, horses, and family. So that's kind of just my trying to capture the book in a paragraph, and there's so much in there. And as I've said before we started officially here, that there's a many episodes worth of content in this book, and I would really encourage people to go out and track down a copy. But yeah, what kind of inspired you to write the book?
Well, one of the things that I've realized long ago about knowledge is that knowledge without application is pretty much worthless. And I or somebody in my positions could gain a lot of knowledge, but if they don't apply it or share it with someone, what's the worth of it? And I didn't want my life to be that way. I've shared what I've gained with my family, and then also lots of our employees and stuff, and shared with people that I've gotten to speak with and mentor. But the actual catalyst that inspired me to write this book is this past January or December. The Matador Cattle Company, which is owned by Koch Industries, sold. And they had been in ownership of this ranch for 70 years. They purchased it in 1951. Of those 70 years, I spent 37 years there. But when it sold, it was kind of an end of an era, and so our son, who grew up there his whole life there, he was inspired to write a Facebook deal about the end of an era. And he's a very good writer, very eloquent, and passionate about it. So he wrote a blurb on Facebook and posted some pictures that he or his mom had taken, most of them that his mom had taken on. And the response to his deal was just unbelievable. Like within a day or so, there's like 2,000 shares
wow.
of that deal, and it went all over. And then the papers got a hold of it and interviewed me, and because it's fascinating. You know, the Western lifestyle and ranching has a romance about it, but it's also got some realities. And so I felt the other thing that I would follow up with is a number of years ago in the early 80s, say mid 80s, John Lincoln, who was president over Koch Industries for a time, wrote a book called Rich Grass and Sweet Water, which was basically the history of the Koch ranches, all of them, all over the western United States. And we had quite a bit of stuff in there. I wrote some excerpts in there, and I was on the cover of his book, but discussed about the formation of the ranch and then kind of the history and that generation of employees, key employees, and what went on. And at the end of it, he charged that maybe one of us 4 or 5 managers at the time would be the one to continue the next story.
Yeah.
So here we are.
Yeah. And I really appreciated some of the stuff that you said in the book, kind of about I don't know if mission creep is the right word, but where there was a well-structured business there at the Beaverhead Ranch, and it was designed for grazing as much of the year as possible. And just the fact that because something became available to purchase didn't mean that it should be purchased if it didn't suit that mission. And if we were going to try and stock it with cattle, things were going to get out of balance. And I think you kind of insinuated, or maybe flat out said in the book, that contributed to the sale. Is that an accurate understanding of what you're saying? I would
assume so. I don't know that, but I would assume so, because it had to affect profitability, per cow profitability. And we always had to be profitable, and we had to be safe. So if you couldn't do that, you want to be an asset, not a liability to a company.
Yeah, very good. Well, early on in the book, you write this sentence, and I think it'll be kind of serve as an outline for a good portion of what we're going to talk about today. But you say this: I would spend the next 11 years gaining experience, skills, resourcefulness, and knowledge to equip me for a much bigger agricultural career than I had ever anticipated. And was that during the transition into the cow boss position?
That 11 years would have been the start when I went to Sage Creek. I spent 11 years at Sage Creek, and I was the foreman of that place. It's about 80,000 acres in one chunk there, and it was the site of one of the first rest rotation grazing systems in all the world, and still continues. But that was the start of that period of time, and for those of us that have been through ranching for profit schools or that way of thinking, basically those 11 years were working in the business. I was gaining knowledge, but I was getting an experience. But to me, working in the business, a lot of that is centered around learning skills, basic skills, and skills that are going to benefit you in the future. And while skills are needed, their skills can be taught, but it takes time to learn them. I mean, you just can't bail into something like a ranch deal. I always felt like it took a new employee. It really took them about 3 years to really get their arms completely around an operation. So that being said, the earlier management styles that a lot of operations still have, the kind of command-based deals. A lot of times the employee doesn't stay there long enough to gain that needed experience. But I think it's really important that a person gets that experience and skills. And I was on a number of different advisory boards. I was for the Montana State University College of Ag for a while. And one of the things that I saw and brought to the table for that group was the college grads that we were getting, and not just from MSU, but from all over. They didn't have any practical experience. They had a passion for it. They might have been kids from back east or whatever. They had a passion for it, but they didn't have an understanding of what it was like being on the land and growing up on it, like a kid that maybe has grown up on a place. So we suggested, and they fostered in an intern program that was necessary. They had to do an internship before they could get a degree in some of those college deals. And I saw that as being real beneficial dealing with agency people like Forest Service or BLM range cons that had absolutely no practical experience out on the land with livestock or anything. They'd gotten an education, regardless whether it was back east or whatever. They had an understanding of plants and that sort of thing, but didn't have a practical application.
Yep.
And that to me, like I said before, knowledge without application is worthless. So I really learned how, in those 11 years, how to apply the knowledge that I was gaining. I was getting a lot of experience. I mean, I came off a small place, and I had lots of experience with animals and everything. And we had neighbors that had bigger places. So I had some stockmanship, experience, but not when you're talking 1,000, 2,000 cows in one herd.
Yeah.
It's different scope. And then you may, like Sage Creek was such a wonderful place to learn, because especially the first year, it was 80,000 acres. There was one little piece of it that was fenced off, that had been fenced off as a corner for a kind of a trail trap, but the rest of it was one pasture. And we had, for some years, we ran up to 2,300 pairs in that one herd. Once we got into the rest rotation deal, that was split up into 6 pastures, each with about 14,000 acres. But we learned how to handle cows, large herds with very few people, and how to trail a cow without the benefit or the negative part of a fence line or a lane. Yeah, you learned how to be effective at trailing cows, influencing where you needed to and where you couldn't. And so we learned quite a bit there. We also developed skills that, as far as handling cows, handling herds, handling crew, calving heifers. I calved about 5,000 heifers through Sage Creek while I was there. Mostly just a very small crew, and tough conditions.
Right.
And then, some years we had stalker calves, steer calves that we'd run over. I learned how to reroute water bellies, so I'd do that. We did most all our own vet work, unless it was something that was required by law. But I continued to learn preg testing. I had learned to preg test before I went there, and then I got more experience doing that.
Right.
So,
yeah, some of these, for an example, for some of these skills you talk about in the book, you mentioned being able to pick up a herd of cattle, get them paired up. I don't remember if this was Tom Griggs that you were talking about was being one of the better ones at this. But
yeah, Jim Bishop. Tom was good at it, but Jim Bishop was absolutely the best at starting a big herd of cows. He had patience, and Jim wasn't the best cowboy in the world, and he'd tell you that, but he's savvy, and there's a lot of people that he's worked for didn't really know that. But he could take a crew of guys, young, inexperienced guys, even if they were, and he could get them mothered and started on a trail. And ultimately, if you think about that, your goal, there's a lot of things similar to that in the way you approach a business or ranching. Our goal was not to get them out of the trap and onto the trail. Our goal was to be in the Centennial Valley 3 days later with them all mothered. It's kind of like,
wow.
It's kind of like calf crop percentage. Your goal isn't to have a 95% calf crop percentage at calving time. It's to have a 95% calf to take to market in the fall. So,
yeah. Well, and what I was thinking when I was reading that was, this sounds like Tom Knopfsinger, but I don't even know if you knew who Tom Knopfsinger was then, I don't know if anybody knew who Tom Knopfsinger was then, but it was kind of one of those things like we look at these guys that have maybe popularized these ideas as revolutionary, but here you guys were figuring these things out, the value of them. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
So, as we've gotten more communication and technical stuff, to where we can share knowledge much more fast, more quickly now than we could then. A lot of them, there was guys out there in the hills, old cowboys and hands that nobody ever knew about. And that they didn't go about putting on seminars or clinics. They were doing their job. And if you were smart enough to keep your mouth shut and pay attention, you could learn quite a bit from them. But a lot of them wouldn't volunteer a lot of stuff. It was just their way. You kept your head down, your mouth shut, and watched, and you could learn. But Tom Grigg he was a cow farmer when I went there, and he was a genuine hand in a lot of ways. A horse hand, cow hand, one of the most efficient guys at sorting cows I have ever seen. He, and we did a lot of roe deer and that kind of stuff, what they call now. We'd bunch cows out in the hills, hold them up, have them mother them up and peel off inferior or old cows with calves on them. Or we did a lot of sorting in the fall, culling cows, or dries off in the spring. But he could help you learn how to hold a herd, what to do as far as being a turnback. You're not there to cut the cow. That guy that's in the herd is cutting the cow. You're there to turn everything else back. And if you can't turn them all back without spilling the one he's got, you still turn it back. Don't be the cutter. But he could set up a herd of cows to where when he came out of that herd of cows, and he did it in kind of a different way. A lot of people just keep them bunched in one big round bunch, but like sorting dries off, he kind of created kind of a V in the middle of them, in the face of them, and he could work off both sides of that V. But he would work in there, he'd find what he wanted, bring that cow out, and he could go right back in that V, and he knew exactly where the next one was. He was very efficient at doing that. And those kind of stockmanship skills, they were beneficial both to the cow herd, but they were really beneficial to stockmanship and handling of the animals. And we've been around a long time now. Since we've been gone from the ranch, we do a lot of day work, and we've helped a lot of other people. And it's, you see the transition to being more time-oriented people, to where we're always in a hurry, and use of four-wheelers instead of horses. And I see a real change in the general cow herd in the West of how they're handled and how they handle. It's pretty sad, really.
Yeah. Yep. No, and it's the best stockmanship advice I ever got was from my wife, who told me we've got all day to get this done.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And that's
one of the things I learned from my kind of observing my kids when we trailing cows to the Centennial. It was a 35-mile trail, and we do it over a few days. But a lot of times my kids would be bringing up the drag, and they do a better job of it than us cowboys did, because time didn't mean that much to them. They had a goal where they wanted to get that night. It didn't matter if it took them all day to get there. They were probably going to be pretty well mothered when they got there. But the stockmanship, you just see the way the animals handle. I can think of instances where I go in horseback to try and help somebody, say, gather and move a bunch of cows. And you can ride out there horseback, and the cows seem kind of okay. And then they hear the four-wheeler start up at the barnyard back there. And the instant they hear the motor of the four-wheeler, the cows raise their head about 6 inches, and they all go to the back of the trap or the pasture. They're going to go somewhere. We've conditioned them that way.
Right. Well, they've got a memory, right?
Yeah.
This never ends well. When I hear that, it never ends well.
Experience. Yeah. Yes. Yeah. But it's kind of like cattle handling and safety are a lot the same, in that if you don't have time for either one of them, you shouldn't be out there. If you don't have time to handle your cattle right, or if you don't have time, you don't think you have time to do it safely, you shouldn't be out there.
Yep. Oh, absolutely. My dad worked a job in town as a phone company guy for 35 years, so he could retire to the ranch. Yep. And he was one of the guys on the safety crew for the company in the region, and so we had lots of little bumper sticker sayings that would get written in notes of our to-do list. If you don't have time to do it safely, you don't have time to do it at all, and things like that. Yep. So I appreciate that. That's we talked a little bit about stockmanship. What would you say are some other skills, or what kind of jumps to mind as some other skills that were things that you learned there at Sage Creek?
Well, of course, roping and doctoring animals. I had, we're out there, very small crew or no crew, but we had about 20 up to 2,400 pairs for, from May through December, the 1st of December. And then a lot of years we'd have 600-700 head of yearlings, maybe heifers or steers that we ran in some different country meadows and stuff. So you had some foot rot and normal doctoring things you had to do. Did them on horseback. You didn't have a corral to take them to, so you did them on the end of a rope, and learned how to rope well. And then branding, of course, is a big deal. Always has been a big deal there, an enjoyable time. But we would start branding on the ranch about the first week in May and hope to finish by the 1st of July. And we roped them to start with. We would neck them. And that's something you don't see much of anymore, but it was really, really a very efficient and easy on the animals way, especially in them smaller calves. Even the bigger calves weren't bad for some of us, but you got to think about your crew. Some crew can't flank big calves very good, and it's hard on them. But those smaller calves, it was so easy. It's just like leading a calf on the end of the rope, and you didn't have to swing. You didn't have to disturb them. And that came from Tom Griggs. That's where I learned it, because he learned it in the prairies of Wyoming as a kid on the bug ranch, where you had to keep them paired up. You might have shared ownership in cows, and you had to keep them paired up to where when you roped that calf, you could tell them what brand to put on. And so you slipped in there. You didn't swing. You went in there and just backhanded them, hula handed them, whatever you might want to call it. And so I learned that too. And then just roping skills. Tom helped us learn, and I really liked to rope. And so he developed that skill, helped me develop those skills. Got to where, I really did quite well at roping and have enjoyed it for a long time. And any kind of roping doesn't matter.
Yeah. Yep.
And then preg testing, like I say, preg testing through the years, all the years that I was there. When I was at Sage Creek, I didn't get to preg test too much, just mostly the cows that were there. But sometimes I'd go over to headquarters and help them. But once I became cow foreman, then I was one of the principal. I and the manager were principal preg testers. We preg tested probably 9,000 cows a year. And once I got to be cow boss and then manager, I taught a lot of my guys and gals to preg test. And there's a couple of guys that I can think of now that are still there, actually, that I would put up preg testing against any vet in the country without a ultrasound machine. But even like I preg tested probably 90,000 cows while I was there.
Yeah.
Yep. And one of the other skill that I would share with you that I developed while preg testing and also AI, but preg testing was where I really developed the skill. God gave me the ability to see what I was feeling. I go inside a cow, and so when I taught other people, I found a pelvis out of an old cow, the skeleton, and I rigged it up to where they, inner tube to where they could reach in there and try and make it slack like it could. But I had the ability. God gave me the ability to visualize what I was feeling. So I could preg test with either hand. Most people are one or the other. I'm right-handed, but I preg tested and AI left-handed, of course. But if I needed a second opinion, I just stuck the other hand in there. And so that's been a neat skill that I've really appreciated God given me.
You mentioned early on in this conversation Gus Hormay, and I think we're 250 plus episodes in at this point, and I think you're only the second person to mention him by name. So I'd just like to talk a little bit, as a little aside maybe, about this idea of rest rotation grazing. What were the graze periods on some of those rest rotation systems? Was it longer? They were longer graze periods, weren't they?
Sure. When Gus first set up the first rest rotation deals with some of the Forest Service, Utah, Montana, and some, before he came, the first experimental ones, he had a 4-pasture rest rotation. That was his idea. It didn't take him very long to realize that did not allow enough rest. So he changed it to a 3-pasture rest rotation system. So Sage Creek was set up with a 3-pasture rest rotation system, but it was unique, a little bit unique, because each of those 3 had a lower unit and an upper unit in elevation. And the upper units, the reason they were split up is because the upper units had larkspur in them, poisonous plant. And so you had to deter your entry into those, or you lost cows.
Right.
But at any rate, we could go into, so you went into the first one sometime mid to late May, about the 20th of May, 15th of May, I think we could go in. I think our allotment said we could go in the 5th of May, depending on year, but around the 15th of May, we would go out with cows if we calved them at Sage Creek. we could go out into one of the lower pastures that we were going to use. And we used that during the growing season and to start with, and then we went into the upper portion of that later, still during that growing season. And it depended. Usually it was mid-August before we came out of those 2 units. So it was during the growing season.
Right.
And we timed it to move out of there into the second one that we used. We wanted the seed to be ripe, the grass seed to be ripe, so that we could scatter and implant the seed. And so then the remainder of the year, we stayed in those 2 units, the second 2 units, until about the 1st of December. The third set was completely rested. The whole entire year. And then the following year, we went into that rested pasture and during the growing season. So what it amounted to is you got 2 years of back-to-back growing season rest with a 3 pasture deal.
Right.
And we've got lots of pictures. And of course, Gus had probably 40,000 pictures that he did, and they're at MSU. They're stored at MSU now, but I don't know if anybody's using them.
And so would you say it was like 6 or 7 years then before it would get grazed in the same period of the year? Kind of, would that be a right understanding?
Yeah. I can't remember now. It's been so long. Before you repeated it, to where it got grazed again in the initial growing season. It was 5 years before it repeated. Yeah. And it really, it's amazing what the ground and plants, how it responded. Because before it had been continuous grazing, season long, no boundary fences. There was just, so you had lots of the extreme reaches and lower, easier elevations were overgrazed, and the harder to reach, farther from water, was completely undergrazed. It was a problem with distribution, and so that I got in the first year I was at Sagebrook. We were just starting to put the fences in for that restoration deal, so it was one big pasture when the first year I was there. So I got to see it from the ground up and witness it, and then after Gus died, Sue and I went back, and I could remember I went with him on a lot of his photo plots out there in Sage Creek to redo them numerous times. But then Sue and I, after Gus died, we went back out and retook those photos. And it's been quite a while now of the ones that I could remember. Because the photo evidence really is really effective. It's more effective than showing somebody on paper how this is this and this is that. When you show them a picture of this is how it looked and this is how it looks now, you can't deny it. And he had one of the good things. They had some exclosures we put up right from the start. We put some exclosures up that just restricted cows. Antelope could still get in it, but where cows were restricted from it. And then we had some that were complete exclosures where nothing could get in it. Too high net wire. And it was amazing to see the difference. And there is a picture in the book, just one that we put in there, that accompanied an article George Oshinsky wrote for Range magazine a number of years ago about our restoration deal. It shows what the exclosure looks like on the right-hand side of the picture, and on the left-hand side where it's been grazed through this system for 23 years. And it'll reach up and slap you. You just can't ignore it.
Yeah.
Interesting thing, in one of those exclosures where everything was excluded. It included some willows, aspen, a creek, of course, and sagebrush and grass. But it was interesting to see the willow growth in that exclosure where no ungulates. And there was lots of moose, elk, deer, wildlife, cows. Outside that exclosure, those willows were like an umbrella. That their canopy was like an umbrella. Inside that exclosure, those willows were like a stovepipe. You could almost put your arms around the whole plant, but it was 25 feet high. But I mean, so it could show you a lot of things. There's a benefit to that hedging to some extent on those plants to increase the leaf matter and make them more viable and soil holding. But,
right.
Well, there's so many things we learned from all of that. But the big thing that takeaway for me from what I learned from Gus, I learned a lot about just how plants work and all, but he really understood. He studied, set out there for 2 or 3 summers, and he studied the grazing habits of cows and sheep. He watched how they grazed throughout the day, and then he designed his grazing strategy around the grazing habits of those ungulates. You see a lot of deals now to where they're trying to change the grazing habits of the ungulate to fit their system. In a large Western range operation, that's not going to be very successful, or it's going to take a lot of work and a lot of things.
Yeah. Well, is my math right that 80,000 acres is like 125 square miles? Is that about right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, you're talking a pretty expansive place there to start trying to build, a lot of paddocks and those kinds of things, as we would see in a more intensive system.
You're relying mostly on streams. It was pretty well watered, actually, for that. I mean, there was a lot of area you didn't have much water, but it wasn't that far. I mean, in that kind of a vast landscape, it was pretty well watered. And that, I would say, is pretty typical of most of the entire ranch there on the Centennial and Blacktail side, too. Wasn't too far to water, generally. Sage Creek was probably the most arid, but we tried a lot of different things. We put in some gravity flow water systems and tanks and some of that to help with distribution. But one of the things that's really surprised me that hasn't took off in this region up here is our interior fences, the division fences between all them allotments or pastures, 3-wire suspension fence, post every 60 to 80 feet, depending on the terrain, 3 wires, 2-wire stays in the middle. Wire had to move in the big staples, stockade panel staples. Bottom wire was 16 off the ground, 16 inches off the ground. Top next wire was 12 inches apart, and then the next one 10. So they were pretty low, but they were so effective. You didn't need, a rigid fence. Your cows, and I worked 700 pairs against them fences numerous times by myself. Never had a problem.
Yep.
And it's a lot less hindrance to wildlife. There was a lot of antelope there, but then it got to where there was a lot of elk moved in there and used that, and still do. But the maintenance on that fence is nil compared to a standard fence.
Yep. And was that a barbed wire?
Yeah,
yep.
It was. Some of the last stuff we put in, I think the bottom wire was smooth.
Right. Yeah, I think that's maybe, in our country, that's an antelope thing. They build them that way for the antelope.
Thing. Yeah.
But,
yeah. And it was, I think it was 12 inches between the top and second wire, because it was less likely for an antelope or deer or elk leg to get caught. It gave 2 more inches to where they were less likely to get wrapped in that.
Yeah.
Very, very well. Very effective. And, when you're thinking the cost of building fence now and what you need. I mean, you don't need to overkill, just what's effective.
Right.
And that's enough.
Yep. Well, one of my favorite one-liners from the History of the Working Cows podcast came from Dylan Biggs, who said, "With good stockmanship, it's surprising how poor of a facility you can get the job done in."
It really is.
You don't need a solid guardrail panel to to get it done if you're calm and your approach
really
is right.
Yeah. Yeah. If you're using that facility as a crutch, need to rethink things.
Yep. Absolutely. Yeah. The oddly enough, the other person to mention Gus Hormé was Cooper Hibbard from Sieben Land and Livestock in Adel, Montana there. So
yeah. I know all those folks. I grew up pretty close to there. That's
okay.
Close to there. And I've been on a number of boards with Chase Hibbard.
Sure.
Yeah. Good folks, good stockmen, good progressive people have thought about the land, cared about the land for a long time.
Yep. And you talk about Gus Hormé spending a lot of time out there. There's another Logan Triboneau, I think maybe quoting Allen Nation, but I'm not sure, said the best fertilizer a farmer can add to his field is his shadow. So just getting out there and seeing how they work.
One of the things I just thought of this the other day, and it's a story with Gus, but there was a lot of controversy. Well, during the period that Gus was still alive, toward the later years, amongst agency people of wanting to do away with it, wanting to tweak it. They didn't like the longer grazing term, like what we were talking. They wanted to go tweak it to where it's 21 days, no more. Anyway, of course, sage grouse had come up as being a deal. Anyway, there were some agency folks in our local district that were really anti-grazing. They didn't. Anyway, they would try and think of everything under the sun to come up with why it wasn't working, wouldn't work. So we sponsored and took many tours with any interested parties. And a lot of times there'd be 70, 80, 90 people on these tours out through that to see what it was doing on the ground. We were stopped at this one place, used to be an old sheep bed ground on Little Sage this day. And Gus was talking, and these guys started getting on us about the sagebrush. We'd had a fire there, and we hadn't tried to control burn or anything like that. It was just, but anyway, they got off on the sage grouse deal, and we and Gus were contending to the group that, we've got the habitat here for the sage grouse. That's not the problem with sage grouse population. And we suggested, there's a lot of other predators and other things involved. And they poo-pooed that away. Well, we're standing there. This whole group is standing there and facing Gus, and a sage grouse gets up behind us and flies over the top of our heads, about 20 feet over the top of our heads, out past Gus. It didn't get 150 feet past Gus. And out of the air comes this ferruginous hawk and nails that sucker right there in the air. And Gus just says, "Let's go to the next one, boys."
We had, I was reading about that, and you were talking about your range cons. I'm like, I could name a name that people in this neighborhood would probably still know. I know my dad still knows that name of somebody who was anti-grazing, and in our world, I think it was the green tree frog was going to be threatened if we stayed too long or whatever it was. So, well,
there was any number of deals. For a while there, it was just anything they could come up with. If one didn't work, they kept up coming with another one. And, around 89 or 90, the phrase riparian area, that became the big deal. And that's, I was the cow foreman, and then becoming, just as I became the manager, we had to deal with that on a big, large scale on a Forest Service allotment that they were trying to make us an example. And if we'd have failed, our whole public land grazing industry would have hurt.
Yeah, absolutely. No, 1996 was when we started with our permit, and my parents just sold it last year. So 25 years they did that, and I remember reading your book was just flashbacks to a lot of conversations that I was probably really too young to understand, but I remember these conversations about riparian areas and those kinds of things too. So, you talked about trailing 35 miles up to the summer pasture in May, and I think coming back down. Then did you trail back down 35 miles in December?
Yeah. We trailed everything back from the Centennial and Sage Creek. The ones that went to Sage Creek, they would trail off. We might calve 500, 600 at Sage Creek, and then they'd go out in that restoration deal. But then the remainder that had to fill up that came from the blacktail side. They calved on the blacktail side of the ranch, and then we had to trail them through the hills over to get to Sage Creek. And then the remainder of the cows, roughly 4,000 cows, summered in the Centennial Valley to the south, which was about 35 miles from the Jake place, where most of them calved, till they got to the Centennial Valley.
Yep.
Centennial Valley, part of it's just west of West Yellowstone and Yellowstone Park, about 40 miles. So, that was something that occurred. And the trail up, of course, you had pears and lots of green feed, and so that took longer to get there. The trail home, a lot of times, 1st of December or mid-November, it's pretty wintry. It can be ugly, and the cows want to come home. There's one period, and I don't think Sue put that picture. Yeah, it might be in the picture in the book of heading home. The horses in the Centennial heading them home, but the rest of the calvie that we hadn't already brought out, 1st of December, we just gathered them up and we kick them loose, head them, and they would on their own. They'd go 35 miles, 3.5 hours, and turn in to the Jake place. But we had 2,000 cows that same day. Sue and I put on the road, and they walked that same by themselves in 11.5 hours. They wanted out of there.
Yeah, I was going to ask if there was any memorable stories going either direction that particularly memorable.
That particular day that I'm thinking of, there was about 16 or 18 inches of snow blowed in there, and on the feed wasn't the problem, but the water was. Your water freezes up. You can winter a cow out like that, and they do pretty well. But if the water starts freezing up, you get in trouble pretty quick, and they'll lose condition and vigor, and you can get in trouble. But so we watched that. But that particular day, we sent the guys to gather the horse herd up at the main camp at Staudier, and Sue and I gathered. It was about 2,000 cows out of the lake field or Paul field, which is closer to the road. We gathered those up, and of course they were wanting to go, so we put them on the road. Anyway, it was drifting, and we kind of was coming back towards the boys with the horses, and 4 or 5 of the horses had come out the pasture gate ahead of the others for some reason. The others turned around at the gate and had to run back and have to regather them up. So there's 4 or 5 horses out ahead. Anyway, there's 2 cattle guards along this road, and so the one, there's a gate right alongside of it, and so I went and made tracks in the snow through it, and cleaned off the cattle guard so the horses would see it. We wouldn't have any problem. And then Sue and I got the cows out. We were coming back towards the cattle guard, and we see them 4 horses coming down there, trotting down there. They were all older horses, been up that trail lots of times. We got about 100 yards from the cattle guard and got stuck. Couldn't quite get to the cattle guard. So the horses walk up there. They jog up there, them 4. And they jog up, look at the cattle guard, and they go around the cattle guard through the gate, 3 of them. The 4th one decides he's got to jump the cattle guard. All 4 legs in the cattle guard.
Man.
And it's one of the, the government cattle traps.
Yeah.
Anyway, so
more than a bluff.
Yeah. And so I ran up there to try and help him. I got there and he was thrashing around some. And the instant I touched him, his name was Lippy. He was a little bay horse. And the instant I touched him, he just quit fighting. And so I didn't have anything. I had stuff back in the truck, but couldn't get there. So I hiked back to the truck and get pry bars and stuff. Got back there. I managed to get his front feet out and then started working on the hind legs. And the boys hadn't quite got there yet. I could see them coming with the other horses. Anyway, it's start working on the hind legs, trying to get them out. And noticed one of them's compound fracture way up high. He was done. And he was bleeding pretty bad. So I hiked back to the truck, got my gun, came back, put him out of his misery. So that's the only way we could get out, was across that cattle guard. Did get unstuck, but I'm standing there on the cattle guard having to cut the legs off this horse to get him out of the cattle guard while the guys come through with the other 50 or 60 head of horses through the gate alongside of us. That's when Sue took those pictures of them horses. And we know the story, but it's something you remember forever.
Yeah, right.
Tragic deal.
Yep. Yeah, because like I said, when I asked, or what I was thinking when I asked that question, May in that country and December in that country, you're kind of equally open to a snowstorm. So there's going to be imagine some stories that go along with that trip.
Yeah, there's a well-known horseman now out in California, Bruce Sandiford, that worked for me for a couple, 3 years. Anyway, he was on my cowboy crew. He was one of my key guys for a while. Him and another guy were trailing a bunch of cows, young cows, down out of the Centennial, 1st of December, coming down through the canyon. And some cows got on the wrong side of Blacktail Creek, and it's mostly froze over. He decided to go get over on that other side and follow them out. Horse fell through the ice in the creek. He took a dip in the frozen creek at 20 below zero. And it was 30 miles from anywhere, no truck around. It was 20 miles to where we probably were going to pick him up that night. Him and Dick Slater, they stopped, built a fire, got him dried his clothes off as best he could, and got back on, met us later.
Wow. That's a nip and tuck situation for sure.
Oh, yeah, it could have been really bad.
Yeah. So we've covered a part of this sentence here, and I want to get back to that. And one of the ones that interested me, what drew me to it really, was this idea of resourcefulness. What do you mean by that? You said you gained the experience, skills. We talked about those two. Haven't exhausted them, of course, but talked about them. And then you said resourcefulness and knowledge. What do you mean by resourcefulness?
Resourcefulness, I had the privilege of growing up in a family whose dad and granddad went through the Depression. You learned how to do without or do with what you had. And I really value that. And that's been really kind of fun for me. I can go to somebody's old junk pile and manufacture all kinds of stuff, projects and stuff to use. And I don't have to go buy new stuff. But the same thing is figuring out, like in the Sage Creek scenario, we had a lambing shed there that they'd lamb thousands and thousands of sheep there, but it was set up for sheep. And when we were calving heifers, and so after the first year, I talked to Marion and Tom into letting me convert that lambing shed into a calving facility. Well, they said, that's fine, but we're not going to spend any money on it. So you be resourceful. You use what you got for materials and use resourceful. And it wasn't pretty, but like you were talking about, that facility doesn't have to be the Taj Mahal, but it has to be effective, and you learn how to use it. And so we did. We calved thousands, several thousand heifers through that thing through the years. And we didn't spend any money out of pocket to make it work.
Yep. I was talking to an older rancher in the congregation I pastor the other day, and I said, what really strikes me about working cattle at your family's place is the amount of things that your family can turn into a gate. And one thing that comes to mind is I think at the back of their truck loadout, there's the doors off of an old stock rack with a road sign wired to them, and that's one of the gates in that. I'm like, he's like, yeah, you just got to keep an open mind when you go to farm sales.
Yeah, I'm notorious. I mean, I've got all kinds of stuff that I've built around out of stuff, and one of my fun little deals, I'll do horseshoe statues and stuff, personalized horseshoe statues with people's brands or whatever, or friends, and I'll use old horseshoes and make them look just like a person, and just junk I'll find and make it those. But big projects too. I mean, bigger implements and stuff figured out. In our feedlot at headquarters, it was wooden bunks that were built in 1948, so they're real narrow and kind of hard to keep the hay in. And the cattle would root a lot of the hay out. So for many years, we had guys, we'd go through and pitch hay back. There was more than 1,200 feet. Well, there was 5 rows, 1,200 feet long to pitch hay back in. So we had guys that were having carpal tunnel and problems. So when I took over as manager, I said, we got to change that. So we took a New Holland winter inverter and a drum rake off drum rake, and fashioned them together to where the drum rake would pull the hay away from the bottom of the bunk, and put it up into the inverter, and the inverter would spit it back in the bunk. Those kind of things. Later, we used a self-propelled baler. Took an old self-propelled baler and did that same thing.
Yeah. I appreciate that. That's something that I always have respected in other people, their ability to do those things. And so I've always wanted to improve that skill in myself. And I see, one of the ones that comes to mind is guys that have a side-by-side for check and fence, but instead of getting a side-by-side, they get an old Geo tracker or something like that for $1,500. It's, you can buy 10 of those Geo trackers before you buy one of those new side-by-sides. And those are the plain side-by-sides.
One of the things that's kind of struck me and that I observed for many years that seemed interesting to me is a lot of the innovative things, innovative machines and innovative thinking came out of New Zealand and Australia. There's a lot of hay handling machines and different kinds of things that they were real innovative thinkers there. And then we brought some of their innovation, like for round bale feeders and stuff, innovation that was thought up in New Zealand, and we brought it over here, and then we had it built in Nebraska. But innovation, I mean, that's kind of a societal, almost a societal thing, and maybe a paradigm that that's just part of their makeup, is being innovative.
Yeah,
and being out and that part of that resourceful stuff that you were talking about, that comes from being 60 miles away from your headquarters, 10 miles away from your nearest neighbor. And if you make a mistake, there ain't nobody going to be there to fix it for you. You got to fix it yourself, so you'll learn from it.
Yeah. Yep.
Maybe I could do this different.
Right. Yeah. Dallas Mount spent 9 months, I think, maybe in Australia, 6 to 9 months, I think it was, in Australia. And I did an interview with him when he came back from that. And he said that one of the things that struck him about Australian ranches is the lack of stuff that they have sitting around. They don't have shops and barns and garages chock full of things. It's a few things to get the job done and nothing extra. And, they're talking big places. Those stations in Australia get really expansive. And so they're not just little hobby farms. It's big places, and they just don't have the stuff that we do.
That's been one of my pet peeves with modern day agriculture is we got way too much iron.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. So the last one of these things is knowledge, and I guess if I could ask you to limit it to a couple of pieces of the most useful knowledge that you acquired over those 11 years and over your 37 years at Beaverhead, and those, what are some of the most useful pieces of knowledge that you would say you've acquired?
Well, there's a couple different things. One of them at Sage Creek, managing people. I was 21 years old when I went there, and I had to hire guys that were 3 times as old as I was for my support help. And I was a dumb green kid, and even if I was smart or figured things out, I was still a dumb green kid to them. So it was harder, to get their respect and gain their respect, but learn just a lot about people and human nature and understanding that and understand one of the biggest things I think knowledge gained was understanding that other people's have the same basic desires in a job that I would. There's some basic things that they want out of it. They want fulfillment. They want a sense of accomplishment. They want to be rewarded for their efforts, but they also want some responsibility, decision making, and then they're not afraid of being held accountable if they get the opportunity. That builds more longevity in a crew. That ability to make decisions and be held accountable for them decisions, and then be incentivized when you make the right decisions. That probably, that foundation and gaining the knowledge and understanding human nature and employees, that was probably one of the biggest benefits of knowledge gained in later years in my career, was because then we figured out how to change the way we manage people to where that could occur. And so it's in the book, but we managed to take, when I took over as the manager in 1990, our average tenure on all employees, we had a couple that were there a long time, and I'd been there quite a while, but our average tenure on our full-time employees was 2.5 years. And when I left there in 2011, the average tenure on our full-time employees was 11 years. There's still guys there that I hired 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's good. That's really good stuff, and that kind of brings us to what I thought would be the second half of this episode, but I think we're gonna wrap it up here. No, and I really appreciate that. But you said this equipped me for a much bigger agricultural career than I had ever anticipated, and I really appreciated the way that you talked about the role of faith in your experience there, and some of those things, and the way that it sustained you through, I don't know if betrayal is the right word, but through the end of your career there, didn't turn out the way that you maybe thought it was going to. And so would you mind just sharing a little bit about that? Because I see that as the blessing of God on you was the length that you had there, the success you had there, and just the way that he sustained you through it all.
Yeah, I've just been blessed all through my life. But I'm a believer that God has a purpose for us. And it's just like witnessing to some or sharing your faith in Christ with others. There's people that only I can reach.
Right.
However, that you can reach. Yeah. And God has that purpose for us. So our life has been centered around that. And when you realize that, it helps you realize why you're where you are and when you are, and you never know when that seed that you plant is going to reap rewards for somebody.
Right.
I was thinking of this the other day. Somebody asked me about consulting, and I said, well, it's kind of like they were asking me about expectations and how successful you are in consulting. And I said, well, consulting is a lot like witnessing. You can't expect to plant the seed today and see the fruits of that labor tomorrow.
Yep.
You plant the seed and the fruit will come later.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes it takes quite a while in the consulting deal for people to finally kind of embrace it, see the need, and then the light bulb comes on for them. But you planted the seed some time ago. But now God has been so faithful to me and our family, and allowing us to raise our kids the way we did. Our kids had the most unique growing up. There's very few, and just like me, I mean, how many people in your lifetime do you know that was a simple old farm kid that grew up and then ended up running 500 square miles of Montana for a long time?
Right.
Just not been many people get that opportunity. There's only been 3 or 4 in that ranch's history since Coke had it.
Right.
3 long-time managers.
Yeah, no, that's very good. I really, like I said, really appreciate the book. Do you have an idea as far as an ETA yet, or is it still in the process?
We think it will be by the 1st of September. We're ordering our author copies probably today or tomorrow. We've got through all the formatting, kind of little glitches, everything. Cover's done. I mean, everything is done. We just had a couple of glitches. But so we're quite sure that we'll have it available the 1st of September.
And where would be the primary place for people to?
They'll be able to get it online through raymarxer.com. Is our website that we've got. And then I've got a Facebook page called Cowboy in a Corporate World that they can access that and get more information. But it's going to also be available on Amazon, bookstores. The hardcover books will be direct, and if you want a signed copy, it'll be direct or at a book signing deal. Then we'll do a paperback book, and then an ebook will be available also right away through Amazon. And then soon this fall, when he gets the time, we're probably going to have our son Clayton do an audio book of it. My voice is too monotone and not good enough voice to do it, and he's really good at it. So,
very good. That'll be great. Yeah. No, it's always better when somebody really closely connected to the author can do the audiobook, because they kind of have the character and the inflection and some of those things, so they can read it with some more feeling.
This is all new to us. I never ever dreamed in my lifetime I'd write a book or do anything worthy of writing a book. But sure. God has blessed us so that just feel compelled to share it with others. And I really, when we first started writing this book, I never started writing it until the first week of January.
Wow.
And I had the content written by the 15th of February. I got on a roll.
Yeah.
Early on, what I did is I picked a person that I was writing that book to. And I picked some neighbor ranch kids that are just starting their families. They're just out of school. They're launching off. And that's who I directed the book towards. Although there's so many different facets, many different things in the book, it can address lots of different people. But that's the ones I really wanted to reach, was like college students, those starting out in a career.
Yeah, and as I said at the beginning of this episode, I couldn't think of a better book that's been written in ranching to do that, because it's it's just so practical. It's very good. You did a really great job with that. And the show notes page for today will be workingcows.net/257. workingcows.net/257. People can go there and find a link to Ray's website and go get their copy of the book and maybe track him down. And if I've got any influence anywhere in the near future, I'd love to get you some speaking engagements to talk about the book and talk about
the thing that I've committed to, because there's so many stories, but I just said on my Facebook page, that Cowboy in a Corporate World Facebook page, I'm going to do one story a week at least. Interesting story. I've already done one last week. They're fun stories, but interesting. And then I have the history of that ranch from the initial owners. I have the Orr history, the Orr family history. They gave it to me. It's a lot of information compiled on CDs. They entrusted me with it when they died.
Wow.
From 1864.
Yeah. Yep. And I don't know if we've got time today, but that'd be some bonus content I would like to capture if you got a few minutes.
Yeah, it's fascinating. It's fascinating stuff.
Yep. Ray, really appreciate your time today. Thank you for taking the time. And again, really can't recommend this book highly enough. I'd encourage everybody to go out and get a copy.
Thank you for the interest. I really appreciate it. I'm glad that we connected up. We have like passions, and I'm sure we'll share lots more.
Yes, Lord willing. Very good stuff there with Ray. Really appreciate his thoughtfulness and his ideas and his experience, and got a lot more episodes out of that book that I'd like to talk to him about. So encourage you to head out to raymarxer.com or amazon.com. Find the link in the show notes page, workingcows.net/257, and pick that book up. Very, very good, practical book with lots of real practical wisdom about managing all different facets of a ranch operation. So, very excited next week to share with you an episode with Will Harris of White Oak Pastures, and we're going to talk to Will about regenerating small towns in America and how regenerative agriculture plays a crucial role in accomplishing that goal. So look forward to sharing that with you, and we'll see you again real soon for another episode of the Working Cows Podcast.
We invite you to visit workingcows.net to subscribe to the show via iTunes or Stitcher. You'll also find detailed show notes pages, resources from our guests, and the industry leaders who have influenced them. For more ideas on putting your cows to work for you in a more profitable way, tune in next week.